Hello there, and welcome to the Impact Zone podcast. We're back again talking more TNA wrestling shenanigans. Though I guess we're not really talking about specifically TNA shenanigans here. We're talking about when wrestlers, or perhaps other people that are involved in the wrestling business, say a referee, a commentator, interviewer, or whoever, has heat with the company usually, or wrestlers or other people that are again involved in a company, and just very effectively refuse to work for that company because of the heat that they have with someone or with the company. Or it's usually not with the company, it's usually with somebody. You can't have heat with a company because it is not an entity really, but that's what kind of people do say they have heat there or whatever, like in WWE. So they have effectively heat with Mr. McMahon or whoever runs the company, like from that perspective, so. But anyway, I think it is one of those things. It is tough, again, to sort of negate that. But I think people who don't want to, work with somebody and say, oh, let's see what we can do. Let's see if we can forge a relationship or whatever else it is. Carrying that baggage, you're missing out. Like things change, people change, situations change. I think, you've got to let people, say, well, come on, let's do some business together. At a certain point, I think Matt Hardy and Edge, they had an issue there probably for a little while, but they were both professional enough to come to the table and say, "Hey, we'll work together." And it wasn't Matt Hardy saying, "I won't work with him." It didn't have. Certainly, I'm guessing they had heat for a while. From one of the latest interviews that I heard from Edge, they were kind of like over it pretty quickly, and they were like, "Yeah, let's get on with getting on with business. Let's just make it work and all of that stuff." So that was them, working through a real issue, and I'm sure it was sort of like treading on eggshells at certain times, but I'm sure again that they knew what they were going for, and where people might feel like, oh, this is a bit uncomfortable, but we need to kind of go there, type thing, and whatnot. So that's a good example. They put a very real issue to one side and said, let's make some money. And they could have made a lot more money, but whatever. It is what it is. But they did make a whole lot of money and a whole lot of chatter and talk and whatnot at the time that they did it. So, and it was one of the biggest rivalries going on for a long time, and it still kept going for a long time, especially in the fans' minds. But yeah, whatever. When you have these guys who say, "Oh, I'll never work for Vince again," well, Vince isn't there anymore. So it's a different kettle of fish. Or you never work for WWE. You should never say never, because hey, you don't know who will be running it maybe in 10, 20, 30 years or whatever time it is. Triple H isn't going to run it forever. People forget that, who's going to run it after Triple H? And I'm sure that he's got to start trying to, find somebody that can run the company. I'm sure he can still run it for another couple of years or whatever it is, or another decade or so, or whatever it is, or two even, I don't know. But again, he will have to say at a certain point, hey, I've got to hang up, quote unquote, those books, or whatever. So for people who have said in the past, I'll never work for WWE, now that Vince is not there, it's like, well, now that might be a different kettle of fish because somebody else is running it. And if somebody says, oh, I'll never work for Triple H, What about in 10, 20 years' time when, whatever, he's not running it anymore, when somebody else is running it, or whatever it is? Same with anywhere. Like, I don't want to put words in people's mouths or whatever else it is. So I don't want to say a specific wrestler, but if somebody said, oh, I'll never work in TNA again, like let's say Samoa Joe or whoever, doesn't matter. Like AJ and Samoa Joe and a lot of those guys, I know they had a bad time and whatnot there at certain times and whatnot, and they weren't getting paid correctly and all this other stuff and whatnot. So they had a bad taste in their mouth from previous regimes and whatnot. But that's not the current regime, and sometimes I don't know what the current regime is doing, but, that's no reason to say I won't work with them. If they say, hey, we'll bring you in and we'll pay you and, we'll treat you right and whatnot, and we'll give you, a good run for 6 months or for a year or for however long or whatever else it is, just to show you some respect and just to, give you one last moment here and to, send you off for the fans that, supported you for so many years in this company or whatever else it is. If you want to come in, I think that they should be open to that. And I think that, well, it is more difficult with people that are in AEW or whatever else it is. I get that. But again, if your contract's coming up, you should be like, if I am going to go there or if I'm going to do something there, like, am I open to that? You shouldn't be having heat with somebody or something, or say, even if you do have heat with somebody that is there or something. It's like, well, you know what? That doesn't matter. That doesn't matter, because at the end of the day, even if I've got heat with somebody that's there, I'm going to go for me, and I'm going to go for the fans, and I'm going to go for the legacy that was created there or whatever else it is. That is what you're going there for, or whatever. You're there to tie up loose ends. You're there to say, okay, it's time for me to hang up these boots, and I want to do it in this place at this time and in this way, and I don't care about the rest as long as they're open to it and they're going to say, yep, we're going to pay you and we're going to do the right thing by you and whatnot. You get up off your butt, you be a professional, you say, yep, all right, cool, let's work together. And that's how wrestling should be, in my opinion. Wrestling should be, this thing where you come in, you do your job, you try to become a household name and whatnot. And then if you do, that's great. If you don't, well, the wrestling business doesn't owe you anything in a sense, but again, if you don't, that's, just the way the cookie kind of crumbles, unfortunately, sometimes. Not everyone can do that. But if you do become that household name or sort of that household name, your role is to keep yourself going as long as you can so that you can help the next generation of wrestlers along the way. You've got to be significant so that you can help somebody else be significant, so they can help somebody else be significant, and so on and so forth. It's a cyclical system that keeps going on and on and on forever and ever. It never ends, So you need the past to, build upon and start a new journey for somebody else into their, stardom for their future. And, I think when you see some of the legends and icons and whatnot that have been in this business and they've passed away and whatnot, really, like, a lot of people remember them coming up through the business and winning their first titles or getting their first opportunities in the business and things like this. Realistically, they're not looking at it from the other perspective, because they actually like looking at saying, like, Sting or whoever else it is. Remember when Sting beat Ric Flair for the title or whatever it was? That was great for Sting. He was on his way up and going. He was becoming the man at that time. not remembering that, Ric Flair was the man at that time, and he was handing the baton in many ways to Sting to take that baton, and try to, he was a great wrestler, and he'd become great off of the back of a lot of other wrestlers. And I don't want to go all the way back because it'll take friggin' forever. Who he won, like he won it off Harley Race, who won it off somebody else, who, so on and so forth, all the way back, and Sting held that baton, and then he sort of like the token of that kind of got lost somewhere along the way, but it sort of fell through the cracks and sort of landed on Hulk Hogan, and WCW was kind of a mess, and it never really got passed on properly to whoever was next and whatever was next. Realistically, you still had your Stings and your Ric Flairs, and other people came along like Bill Goldberg and Diamond Dallas Page and Booker T and Scott Steiner and whatnot, but they really had a very small role in being guys at that time. And they didn't really do the best job with a lot of that, transition during that period. When TNA brought in guys like Ken Shamrock, he was never a guy that had been given quote unquote the baton, but everyone knew how legitimate he was, so they were trying to use his legitimacy to try to pass that baton off onto somebody else. Now, that didn't really work out too well, but, they had some young guys that were there. R-Truth, AJ Styles. They had a whole bunch of guys that they were trying to build up, Abyss, and a whole bunch of other people. And later on, they would get Samoa Joe and a bunch of other people along there that started to come up the ranks and whatnot. But during those early days, they really needed to try to foster young talent. They tried to foster James Storm. They tried to foster Bobby Roode. They tried to foster a whole lot of talent, but those were a couple of like the mainstay talents. Eric Young was another one that they tried to foster when he came in, and whatnot. Kazarian was another one of them. There's a bunch of other people that they tried to foster. Like they literally tried to foster everyone, but like those were a few of the people that sort of somewhat broke through the glass ceiling to some degree, or you are memorable enough to sort of like point to those guys and say they should have been a bigger deal or whatever else it is, especially Kazarian. But Eric Young and Samoa Joe and AJ and a bunch of other guys, they actually won the belt. And the same thing like with Kazarian. I think that he had a bit of I'm not trying to put words into his mouth or think whatever, that sort of thing, but he must have had a bit of a bitter taste in his mouth having left TNA back in whenever he left TNA, like, and then going on to do other things, like, and worked for other people and in other promotions and whatnot, and never really got to, get elevated to that next division or that next level. He was always the mid-card hand and whatnot. Now, finally, he's actually getting, main event level stuff. They've put him in a whole bunch of, programs and main events and whatnot, and they're putting him in a main event upcoming soon at Rebellion. So, again, they've tried to keep him strong, and they've tried to keep doing stuff with him and keep him in storylines and whatnot. So, again, and that's not just for him. That's, not just because he had heat or he didn't have heat or whatever it was, but because they know how the wrestling business works. They know they can put the title on somebody like Frankie Kazarian and, say, hey, we righted some of those wrongs. Maybe it was a bit too late in some regards. Like the same with Alex Shelley. He probably should have won the title years and years and years ago as well. Didn't win the title, and then he finally did. And it was like, yeah, they were trying to mend bridges by doing that, in some ways, and they were also trying to mend bridges by bringing them back in and saying, hey, you're the greatest tag team in the world, we're the greatest tag team in the world, and you're still one of the greatest tag teams in the world, and we want to showcase that. And hey, we'll give you some tag team title belts, and, you can carry this division, and then we'll find some young kids to throw in that division, and will hopefully you can elevate them at some point down the track, and when they're worthy, or whatever. I think that happened way quicker in some terms than what perhaps was planned in some ways, or whatever it was. But I think still that that is what was meant to happen in many ways. Like that's what should have happened in many ways. They should have used those, and they did use those guys in the way that they should have used them. They're veterans. You need to treat them with respect and need to give them something to work with. But you need to take, again, we've talked about this before, but you need to give them something so that they're already somebody to look at and go, damn, those guys are back at the top again. They were the greatest before. Now they're proving it again a decade later, or whatever else it is. And they're kicking ass right now in WWE. So, kudos to them. But again, they're there to not just be great. They're there to help give young guys that rub of being like, you beat us, the Motor City Machine Guns, one of the best tag teams of all time, if not the best tag team of all time, especially in the modern era, that's still doing this. That kind of rub is a very rare thing that not many people can kind of get. That's the same idea that they've got with the Hardys right now, giving it to a legacy act to say, okay, we're going to give you this, to prove that, we value you, we respect you, and we know the significance that, you have in our promotion, and whatnot. And, hey, we're going to build up some young guys to try to face you, and then they're going to take those belts off of you at a certain point, or they're going to win those belts somehow, some way, and you guys are going to lose them, in somehow, some way. Like maybe it's Ultimate X or whatever else it is. Probably not Ultimate X, but you never know. But again, something like that where somebody, wins the titles and they didn't really lose them, or whatever else it is, but they still lost them. So, that is there. So again, that is the plan, to try to, put somebody else over. And you shouldn't have heat for thinking, oh, this is my spot, or whatever else it is. Yes, it was your spot in many ways, but now you've got to hand that spot over to somebody else. You've got to share the limelight. You can't be the main attraction forever. If you're smart enough, you'll go away and reinvent yourself and come back and then make more money at a certain point, like Hulk Hogan did. He went away, sort of, and, he reinvented himself, and then he came back and made even more money because he decided to change things up, because people were kind of sick of the same old shtick, and then, it never really, fixed from there, because it never really came to the point where he actually, properly gave that baton to somebody else, and they pinned him 1, 2, 3, and it was a moment, and then he could come back, several years or several months or whatever it was later, and just be a legacy act, and just have big matches or big programs or whatever else it would be against some of the younger talent that needed, to be worked with. And of course, some of them, you can't put everyone over, but, because the law of diminishing returns and law of diminishing returns of saying, oh, he's back now for a 1 month program. Oh, well, for the last 6 times that he's come back, he's always lost. So whatever it is, or even 1 or 2 times he's always lost. So he's obviously going to lose this one because he's never around anymore, or whatever else it is. And unless you're going somewhere with that or whatever else it is, it's well, I don't know. That's kind of like where I'm at with John Cena right now. I'm kind of on the fence because, and I think a lot of people might be kind of on that fence of being are we sure that they're actually going to pull the trigger on John Cena winning the title? Because ever since he's, been a part-time wrestler, effectively, he's been the jobber guy. He hasn't won any of these matches that he's been in for ages. So that doubt is kind of there, but in a sense, it's well, of course, we're not 100% worried about that, but it's one of those things that is an underlying issue of saying, well, what's going on here? Obviously, at a certain point, he's going to lose, and that baton's going to be passed to somebody else. Now, whether that's Cody Rhodes at WrestleMania or somebody else, coming along down the road is another story, or whatever else it is. But again, you could go back and say, okay, let's look through all the people that he's lost to in the last, 5 to 10 years or whatever it is been, that are on the current roster today. And maybe you say CM Punk or whatever else it is, or whoever else it is the ultimate person that he's going to lose to, or whatever it is. It doesn't matter. You make those decisions, not me. But you've got Austin Theory. You've got a whole bunch of other guys that he's lost to. Can't probably face The Rock again, but he's lost to Roman Reigns. He's lost to a whole bunch of people that are, on that roster. Lost to Seth Rollins. Lost to a whole bunch of people that are on that roster. Lost to Kevin Owens, even though he's injured right now. Hopefully he'll be back some point. But again, that's what you kind of do with him. Start saying he's lost to this person in the past, so they're re-challenging him now, and then he wins against them and wins against this person and that person and basically all the people that he lost against, so that you're telling that story of, he's getting his redemption in some ways, but there's this other challenger that's on the periphery, whoever it is, and they're upcoming, and it looks like they're gonna beat Cena somehow, some way. He's dodging them at every turn or whatever else it is, or whatnot. That's a way to sort of build up that new talent, so that you've got something there to, replace John Cena. And you can't just have Cody Rhodes. And again, we don't know how long Roman Reigns is going to be there. And even if he's going to be there, he's going to be on a part-time schedule. And The Rock's probably not wrestling again. So again, and then you've got probably Seth Rollins looking to hang up the boots at some point too. He's been around for a long time now. And it starts becoming well, how much longer are you going to do this? Same with Moxley and AEW. They need to do the same thing. They need to go, okay, Moxley is our top guy, or has been our top guy a lot of the time that he's been here. We've had other top guys in the promotion, but he's been our go-to solid guy for so long and whatnot. We need to build one of these young guys, and MJF is in my opinion, he's the best guy that they've got, but I think you can't just have MJF. You have to have other young up-and-coming stars. Swerve is kind of there in it as well. They kind of have done stuff with him as far as being the champ, and same with Hangman Adam Page. So, you've got a few other people that are kind of there, that are kind of starting to brew and percolate. And it feels like they're kind of trying to fill out this upper main event sort of card, and they've got to, try to make as many people as possible. Again, same thing. You've got to try to make Darby Allin a main eventer. You've got to try to make whoever else it is a main event, like, proper guy. Like, people know that they're the main event and they're the attraction, and they have to fulfill the roles of being a champion and being, the company guy and doing all of that stuff. They've got to not be squeaky clean, but they've got to be, able to go to do interviews, be presentable, and, do that stuff that, the company needs them to do. And if they're not willing to do that, well, then that's what, really gets you to being the top guy in the promotion. And that's the sacrifice that it takes to kind of, the number of hours and whatnot that you put in. And again, if people get heat for, saying, oh, I never got the chance or whatever, or I never get the opportunities, well, how much effort are you actually putting in? That's the thing that really gets you to being the top guy. And a lot of people, had been in the business for many years. Hogan was in the business for many years before he became the top guy. I don't know, other people have been in the business for many years as well. Don't forget that. I know Eddie was in the business for many years. I know, Ray was probably in the business for quite a while as well. Eddie and Ray and Malenko and Jericho and guys like that, they are actually in the business for quite a long time before they got to, like, WCW. Like, that was their first, like, truly national, like, exposure, and international exposure. But they'd been in Japan working for many years, and actually perhaps their first real, like, national exposure was in ECW, but whatever, that was still pretty small at that time and whatnot. But again, like, you can't have heat with people, like, holding you down. Well, you can, but you can't have heat with them holding you down, because the only thing that holds you down is your own, like, ability to get out there and do the things. Like, if people see that you're good enough, eventually people will go, well, even if these other people sort of don't put you over, they will recognize you. And that's what, really makes somebody, later on, is if they, hey, no, I did the right thing and I put in the time and I put in the effort and, did all the extra work and made all the extra sacrifices and, all of that stuff to put myself in that position. And, that is what it takes. You can't blame anyone for you not putting in a certain amount of the work. You can blame somebody for saying, that doesn't work for me, brother, or whatever else it is, and that sort of thing, obviously. But if you didn't go out there and do the media, if you didn't go out there and do the work, and I know back in the 90s it was a lot different or whatever, but still, they still had TV and radio and other things that were out there that you could do, to get people to buy those tickets, to get people to buy those pay-per-views, and whatnot, and just to be there and to be saying, hey, I'm here representing, the company, and my name's Mike Santana, or whatever it is, like, and I'm going to be fighting this sucker over here, and I'm going to kick his butt, or whatever else it is, and somebody else comes along and says effectively the same thing. My name's Mustafa Ali, and I'm going to wrestle Santana, and I'm going to kick his butt, and so you better come and see it, and having these promos and having these programs and having those intense sort of matches or intense programs is what draws people in. That theater that you get to see, so again, holding on to a grudge, holding on to some sort of heat. If you don't like someone, you don't like someone. But, like, saying, "Oh, I won't do business with that person." Same with like Brett and Sean. I know that they had heat, but the thing is, they actually wrestled together pretty darn well because they knew, they were both great professional wrestlers, and they both knew the art of the game, and they were both great at what they were doing. They weren't just average wrestlers or just decent wrestlers or good hands or whatever else it was. They were top tier, and they knew what to do, and they knew how to be something else and be bigger, and promote themselves and promote the company, and do the things that got those people in the arenas. And at the end of the day, they did the work in the ring and did what they had to do, um, despite not liking each other, and having such a rivalry before the screw job and even after the screw job sort of happened. Like, they didn't work together for very long, but they were still in the same locker room and whatnot afterwards, or virtually in the same building at least afterwards. So it was like, they were still somewhat like, there and saying, "Hey, did you know?" Like Brett was saying, "Hey, did you know that shit was going down?" And Sean was trying to say, "Hey, I didn't know about that," or whatever else it was, even though he did. But you know, things like that. It's like saying, "Well, I had to say that, Brett." Like later on, he'd say, "I had to say that, Brett." And like back then, again, Sean was a different person. And it is what it is in some regards, like, but again, it's one of those things you've got to kind of realize, hey, this was a different time, it was a different place, whatever, that sort of thing, you know, um, and you can't hold grudges, like you can't, because if you say, hey, we're never going to work together, well, you're never going to get that money out of it. Wrestling's all about making the money out of anything that sort of comes your way or comes up, or something that somebody says, hey, do you want to work this angle? And somebody says, nah, I don't really want to work that angle, like doing a alcoholism angle. There's a certain bar at which you start saying, well, at what point is it like really in bad taste? Like, or whatever else it is, or whatever, anything. Like, at a certain point, it is hard to say because it's like the line is very blurred, but you've got to make it about, again, what's going to go on in the ring at the end of the day. You can't take it too far out of the wrestling space, because if, again, you're you are intentionally trying to get hit with somebody. I don't always say that somebody would, but again, if you're sort of intentionally trying to be like putting your own views in some ways onto somebody else, it's like, well, or you're thinking that this is like you're working yourself into a shoot or whatever else it is, it's like, well, that hurts you. Like, again, like CM Punk and Jeff Hardy, I think Jeff worked himself into a shoot there a little bit many years ago. But Punk, I think, was just, I don't know, because Punk's always controversial, and he always has things to say and whatnot, and maybe he didn't approve of everything, but again, like, work is work and business is separate, work and play are separate, so I don't know, but again, you can't then turn around and say, oh, well, you can, but obviously it's one of those things that you shouldn't. You shouldn't be like, oh man, I'm never working with Punk. Why? That's probably where you're gonna make the most money, if you work with Punk, because there's a real legitimate story there, and you've got this, thing that you can focus in on and do, and like it's gonna be a big deal. Like it's gonna do something that's going to, again, make you both more money in the long run. So, and again, like, Jeff, he was a big deal, and he could have been a really big deal in WWE for even longer. He was a big deal in TNA, certainly for a while there as well. But, he made a few mistakes and whatnot and had his own issues. So, same with like Scott Hall. Like people, say he could have been a bigger deal and he should have been a world champion and whatnot, but he was never really reliable enough to do that. And I don't think he ever, had heat with anyone to say anything about that, but because he knew it was, it was on him in many ways of like, wasn't consistent enough or whatever else it was or whatnot. So, but again, at certain points, you think to yourself, well, he really should have just been like pushed up into that main event scene because it probably would have suited him better. Like, because again, he didn't need to be like that mid card guy and putting on, work rate stuff. He needed to be one of the top guys who was just, working his solid matches and whatnot and solid feuds and things like that, drew people in. That's what he should have been. You have to have your lower card guys, be your workhorses per se more so, and carrying that load in that way. Whereas Hall really wasn't so much that guy, that much. He wasn't a, big workhorse guy, and that's fine. Like if you're going to be a tag team guy, same thing. He was a great tag team guy with Nash and whatnot a lot of the time as well. But again, didn't have to carry a lot of the load, and he could still be a hugely featured performer. And I think, like, again, you look at the other tag teams and things that they worked with at around that time, it is sort of the same story. The baton never really got, somehow, some way they got it, and somehow, some way they never really passed it on that well from them. You had guys like Randy Savage who was there and trying to put over DDP and put him over successfully, very successfully. Pushed him into that main event picture, after that, or somewhat, at least. And I don't really know how you can say how Goldberg really got there, but I think Raven was one of the guys that sort of helped him get over and whatnot. Certainly, like the fans obviously got Goldberg over, but like for people to believe that he could be one of the top guys, suddenly beating, Raven, who had been in ECW a big deal. And though he wasn't as big of a deal in WCW, he was still like a guy that people saw as being potentially a big deal there at some point down the road. Seeing that he overcame that whole situation, people thought, oh, yes, he's on the trajectory now, like he's beat another, somewhat big time player in this mid card. So obviously he's now going up a little bit and like looking towards, the next things at some point. Like, but his popularity that sort of exploded fairly quickly and whatnot because they treated him like something special, in many ways, because he got a good reaction. So they started going, okay, we've got something that's working. Let's keep going with it. Like that's the goal with anything though. And like if somebody says, why is my thing not working and why is it not clicking? It's like, sometimes it's like, you need to stop what you're doing and say, okay, well, instead of what I'm doing, let's change what I'm doing. Look at what Chris Jericho was doing, like in the mid '90s. Like if when he was first there, he was just like this happy-go-lucky babyface and whatnot, generic babyface basically. Um, and when he turned heel, that was great because finally he could let out some of his personality and whatnot that he truly had underneath, you know, and really start to develop himself and to who he really was. And then when he would finally get over as a babyface at some point after that would be when he was sort of somewhat endearing, but he still had all those character traits that people kind of were now enjoying because he was so charismatic still, as being he still had that heel sort of edge or some sort of edge to him, but it's now going in a different direction and people actually can see who you are. You're not just a generic babyface, fighting for good sovereign, things or whatever else it is, you know. And like again, he had some heat with people there because hey, I'm getting over, and why aren't you trying to see if I can be more than just this guy in this position? But again, he didn't hold that, down too much. He said, right, well, I will do what I do and, I'll move on. So at a certain point he said, oh well, if I'm going to work with Goldberg or if I'm going to work with this person or that person or whatever it is, at some point down the road, hey, if we're making money, I'm not worried. That doesn't bother me. If it bothers somebody else, then that's their problem. And if they continue to not want to work with me, then I'll have a problem with them as well there. But I'll just continue to do my own thing. And if they don't want to do stuff, then I'll just move on and I'll do something else and work with people that actually do want to work with me, because there's a lot of people that actually want to work with me because I'm a fairly reasonable guy that does a good job, or did a good job at what I was doing, So, yeah, I think again, the level of professionalism that is required sometimes from some of these people is really big. Like if you have to work with somebody that you kind of don't like or don't get along with, or that like especially back in the day, I think it's like a lot different now, but back in the day a lot of people were like, especially Hogan and whatnot, were like in this position of, nah, I'm not giving this up, it's mine, it belongs to me, I'm the most important, I'm the guy, and they basically viewed like themselves, them own selves as being like, I'm the prototype for whatever a wrestler who wants to be successful looks like. You have to be tan and you have to be buff and you have to be this and you have to be that and you have to be this, that, and the other and whatever else. No one else but me can get over, like in the modern day of wrestling. And that's just a whole load of bullshit. Anyone can get over, and anyone can be successful. That's what Vince sort of, his problem was. He was still looking for more guys that looked like Hogan, big, muscly, beefy, meaty men. Like, and that's fine. Having, some big, muscly, meaty men is fine. Nothing against them. But again, if you're only going to say that's the only thing that I'm going to push or will get over here, then you're limiting yourself quite a lot, because a lot of other guys should be able to get over. Despite that, they should, like, you can work an underdog story and say, okay, this guy doesn't look like, quote unquote, traditional championship material or whatever else it is, but they've got a lot of heart. It's not the size of the dog, it's, that's in the fight. It's the size of the fight that's in the dog that matters type deal, And I think people like Rey Mysterio and other people might have some legitimate source to heat with, that philosophy of booking. Same thing with like Eddie Guerrero and other people that were like, on the other side, it's like, hey man, come on, give us a chance. And it's like, well, we don't believe in you because of your size or whatever. Get out of here, You shouldn't be judging me by my size, You should be booking me to be your top guy despite whatever else. And if Hogan or whoever else has a problem working with me because of my size, then fuck them, type thing in many ways. But yeah, guys, I think it is important to be as professional as possible. You guys get the idea, obviously. But again, it's just one of those things that it's funny to see certain things or whatever at times when, somebody comes along and that sort of thing, and they say things about, especially back in the 80s or 90s or whatever it is, and it's like, oh man, this guy was, even with the Undertaker, he was saying stuff about Hulk Hogan. He was claiming, oh, you hurt my neck, and all of this on that tombstone or whatever else it was, and his head never hit the ground because it was like he was trying to protect his spot and whatever else and all of this. So, but yeah, guys, I hope you have enjoyed this one, and I hope you guys will join me again in another one.